Picture this if you will, a shingle-style palace crowning a Massachusetts hilltop like some benevolent monarch surveying its kingdom, 44 rooms spreading across terraced gardens that cascade down the slope in impossible elegance, each window glowing warm against the Berkshire twilight as servants move through corridors carrying silver trays and crystal decanters. As laughter spills from the drawing room where America's legal elite gather to toast another perfect summer evening, as the scent of roses and money mingles in air so thick with privilege you could choke on it, and then imagine all of it, every glittering fragment, slipping through the fingers of the women who loved it most, not in some dramatic conflagration or scandalous collapse, but slowly, inexorably. In the way empires always crumble when the world changes and the money runs out and the servants stop coming and the woman left standing realizes she cannot hold back time itself no matter how desperately she tries. This is Naumkeag, and this is the dark story of how one widow watched an empire die, how her daughter tried to resurrect it through sheer force of will and vision, and how both women ultimately learned the cruelest lesson of the Gilded Age, that beauty built on bottomless wealth becomes a burden when the bottom finally appears, that houses designed for armies of servants become prisons when those armies desert, that gardens conceived as eternal monuments to taste become accusatory witnesses to your failure when you can no longer afford to maintain them, and that the greatest act of love sometimes means surrendering everything you've spent a lifetime trying to save. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand how this empire was lost, we must first understand how impossibly, arrogantly, magnificently it was built. Must travel back to 1885 when a self-made man named Joseph Hodges Choate, born not to old money but to respectability, a Salem boy who'd clawed his way to the pinnacle of New York's legal world through brilliance and charm and a wit so razor-sharp that his courtroom performances became the stuff of legend, whose bon mots were repeated in the finest drawing rooms from Boston to Washington, decided he needed a summer retreat, a place where his wife Caroline Sterling Choate, that trained artist and tireless advocate for women's education who'd helped birth Barnard College into existence through sheer determination and progressive conviction, could escape the suffocating summers of Manhattan society, where their 5 children could breathe clean Berkshire air untainted by the city's coal smoke and moral compromises, where he could entertain the robber barons and railroad magnates and Supreme Court justices whose legal battles he won with such devastating eloquence that opposing counsel sometimes simply conceded rather than face his withering cross-examinations. Joseph hired Stanford White, that architectural wunderkind of McKim, Mead and White, who was then just 32 years old and hungry to prove he could conjure magic from wood and shingles and site-specific genius, who was already making his reputation as the man who could translate his clients' wealth into architectural poetry that spoke of taste rather than mere ostentation, and together they conceived Naumkeag, the Native American name for Salem, Joseph's birthplace, a deliberate invocation of his origins, a reminder carved into the very identity of the house that this palace was built not by inherited fortune or dynastic succession but by a man who'd earned every dollar through the sweat of his intellect and the force of his personality and the brilliant manipulation of America's legal system in that golden age when lawyers were kingmakers and the courtroom was theater, and Joseph Hodges Choate was the greatest performer of them all. Construction began in 1885 on a hilltop so steep, so seemingly impossible to build upon that conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done, that it required engineering feats and massive terracing, and the import of countless tons of soil and stone and the labor of dozens of workmen who carved a buildable plateau from the mountainside. But Joseph Choate was not a man who accepted conventional wisdom, and Stanford White was not an architect who let topography defeat his vision, and what they built together over the next 2 years was something unprecedented in the Berkshires. Something that would stand as a rebuke to the pompous limestone chateaux in the French style that the Vanderbilts and their ilk were erecting in Newport like monuments to dynastic pretension and European aspirations, not an imported fantasy but an organic American structure, all wood-shingled exterior that weathered to silver gray, all gables and wraparound porches and asymmetrical rooflines that captured light in ways that made the house appear to breathe and shift and live, all wide windows that framed the mountain views like paintings. All interiors that flowed from room to room with a casualness that belied the sophisticated planning behind every sight line and circulation pattern. Inside those 44 rooms, Caroline Choate exercised her artist's eye with the confidence of a woman who traveled extensively, who'd studied in Europe, who developed her aesthetic sensibilities not through idle dabbling but through serious engagement with art and design and the conviction that beauty was not frivolous but essential to human flourishing. And she filled corridor after corridor with Chinese export porcelain collected on family travels to the Orient, with textiles that told stories of distant markets and forgotten craftsmen, with furniture that married American craftsmanship to European elegance without slavishly imitating either tradition, with paintings that ranged from formal portraits to romantic landscapes, and most impressively with books. Thousands upon thousands of books lining the library walls and that encyclopedic collection that spoke to Joseph's voracious intellect and insatiable curiosity, to Caroline's conviction that a house should educate as much as it sheltered, that every room should offer opportunities for improvement and enlightenment, that privilege carried with it not just the right to comfort but the obligation to cultivation. And beneath all that visible beauty, hidden from the guests who would soon stream through Naumkeag's grand entrance on those perfect summer weekends when the Berkshires glowed with possibility, lay the machinery that made the fantasy possible, the infrastructure of service that allowed the illusion of effortless elegance. The servants' quarters tucked discreetly into the back wings and upper floors where chambermaids and footmen slept in rooms a fraction the size of the guest quarters they maintained, the narrow staircases down which maids carried breakfast trays at dawn and up which they hauled bath-water before indoor plumbing made such brutal labor obsolete, the kitchen domain where a tyrannical cook commanded her subordinates with military precision and volcanic temperament, the scullery where the lowest servants scrubbed pots until their hands cracked and bled, the butler's pantry where silver was polished until it threw back reflections sharp enough to shave by, the still room where preserves were made and teas were blended, the laundry where Irish immigrant girls scrubbed and pressed the endless mountains of linens required to maintain the illusion that wealthy people lived in perpetual freshness, that their sheets were always crisp and their tablecloths always spotless and their undergarments always pristine, and always, the unspoken rule that governed every interaction between upstairs and downstairs, between the served and the servants, that domestic staff should be invisible, that they should materialize with refreshments precisely when needed and dematerialize afterward like benevolent ghosts, that their labor should leave no trace except comfort and satisfaction, that the machinery of privilege should never intrude upon the consciousness of the privileged, that the wealthy should be able to live in their bubble of beauty without ever confronting the human cost of maintaining it. Outside the house, the grounds required their own army, groundskeepers who manicured every blade of grass with scissors and kept the gravel paths raked in perfect patterns, gardeners who coaxed blooms from the terraced plots according to Caroline's exacting specifications, who understood that a garden was not just plants but a composition that changed with the seasons and required constant editing and adjustment, who worked from dawn until dusk ensuring that every view from every window presented a tableau of controlled nature, of wilderness tamed and disciplined and forced into aesthetic service. For 3 decades, from that first summer in 1886 until Joseph's death in 1917, Naumkeag hummed with a precision that made it seem eternal, made it easy to forget that the whole elaborate performance required not just Joseph's legal brilliance earning the fortune that paid for everything, and what a fortune it was, built case by case, victory by victory, until Joseph Hodges Choate commanded fees that would make modern lawyers weep with envy, but an army of 30, sometimes 40 servants and groundskeepers whose combined labor allowed the Choate family to live in a state of comfort that would have seemed magical to previous generations, to live without ever thinking about where hot water came from or how meals appeared or why the house always smelled of beeswax and lavender, to live in the bubble that immense wealth creates. That bubble that insulates you from reality and consequences and the brutal mathematics of labor and cost until the bubble inevitably, inexorably bursts. Those were glorious summers, make no mistake. Summers when Andrew Carnegie himself might climb the hill to debate economic policy with Joseph while Caroline sketched in her studio, summers when Supreme Court justices relaxed on the wraparound porch and deals worth millions were struck over brandy and cigars in the library where cigar smoke curled up toward the coffered ceiling and power moved through the room like an invisible current, summers when the Choate children ran wild through the grounds with the children of other elite families, forming friendships and alliances that would shape American business and politics for decades, summers when the house fulfilled its purpose as theater, as stage, as the physical manifestation of Joseph and Caroline's place in the American aristocracy, that peculiar American aristocracy that insisted it wasn't an aristocracy at all but a meritocracy, that claimed to despise inherited privilege while creating institutions and marriages and business arrangements that ensured wealth stayed concentrated in the same families generation after generation. Joseph Choate's appointment as ambassador to the United Kingdom from 1899 to 1905 represented the pinnacle of his public career, the recognition that he wasn't just a brilliant lawyer but a statesman worthy of representing America at the court of St. James. And during those years Naumkeag sat mostly empty except for the skeleton crew of caretakers who kept it ready for the family's eventual return, who kept the silver polished and the floorboards waxed and the gardens weeded even though no one was there to see them. Because houses like Naumkeag don't tolerate neglect, they demand constant attention even in absence, constant feeding of money and labor, constant vigilance against the entropy that waits patiently to reclaim every human achievement, every act of building, every assertion that humans can impose permanent order on a universe that tends inexorably toward chaos. When the Choates returned from London in 1905, they resumed their summer ritual, April through November every year, though the house felt different now, emptier. Because fewer of the children came, they'd married, established their own households, lived their own lives in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, making careers and raising families and gradually loosening their connection to the family seat that had seemed so central to their childhood, until really it was just Joseph and Caroline and their unmarried daughter Mabel, born December 26, 1870, fourth of 5 children, a woman who would turn out to possess her father's determination and her mother's artistic sensibility but who, for reasons that remain mysterious in the archival record and tantalizingly absent from the family correspondence, never married, never accepted any of what must have been numerous proposals given her wealth and family connections, never left Naumkeag for her own household, never separated her identity from this house and these grounds and the legacy her parents had built, and who would spend her entire adult life in a kind of suspended animation, neither child nor fully independent adult, neither mistress of her own establishment nor merely dependent daughter, existing in that peculiar social category that the Gilded Age created for unmarried women of means, the devoted daughter, the family caretaker, the woman whose life's work was preserving and extending what others had created. And then, in May 1917, on the 14th day of that spring month when the Berkshires were just beginning to green and Naumkeag was being prepared for another summer season, Joseph Hodges Choate died suddenly of heart disease at age 85, died at their New York City townhouse at 8 East 63rd Street surrounded by family but probably wishing he was in the Berkshires, died having accumulated a net estate worth $4,629,879, a staggering fortune in an era when a working man might earn $800 a year and a servant might earn $200 plus room and board, a fortune that represented thousands of cases won and fees collected and investments made and the compound magic of wealth accumulating across decades. And in that moment, in that final heartbeat, Caroline Sterling Choate, aged 80, became a widow, and Naumkeag's fate shifted irrevocably from a summer retreat maintained by a successful lawyer's ongoing income to a property sustained by inherited capital that would, inevitably, eventually, mathematically, run out. The will, filed for probate within days of Joseph's death, disposed of the estate in the careful manner of a man who'd spent his life drafting legal documents and understanding exactly how wealth should be structured to minimize taxes and maximize dynastic survival. Caroline inherited the bulk of the fortune along with the New York townhouse and Naumkeag and all their contents. The other children received generous bequests and trust funds. Mabel's future was secured through her own inheritance. And the understanding that she would continue living with her mother and caring for the properties, and various charities and institutions that Joseph had supported received commemorative gifts meant to ensure his name would be remembered in perpetuity, carved on buildings and attached to scholarships and woven into the institutional memory of the organizations he'd served. Caroline inherited not just wealth but responsibility, not just property but the obligation to maintain what she and Joseph had built, to preserve the life they'd created, to ensure that Naumkeag continued as it had for 3 decades, and for the next 12 years, from 1917 to 1929, from age 80 to age 92, she maintained Naumkeag in something approximating its old glory, still spending every summer on the hilltop though her mobility declined and her energy waned and the stairs grew steeper and the rooms grew larger and the house that had once felt like sanctuary began to feel like burden. She still employed the staff necessary to keep the 44 rooms habitable, though finding good servants grew harder every year as young people increasingly rejected domestic service for factory work and office jobs that paid better and didn't require the subservience and constant availability that traditional service demanded. Still oversaw the gardens, though age made her less able to personally direct the work that required younger bodies and sharper eyes and the physical stamina to walk the terrace grounds in summer heat. And always, she had Mabel beside her, Mabel who at 47 was settling into what society termed spinsterhood, with neither apology nor apparent regret, Mabel who was developing her own passions that would define her later life, for historic preservation and architectural conservation, for horticulture and garden design, for collecting Asian art and antiques, for the particular beauty of the Berkshires that she was coming to understand not just as scenery but as heritage, as something fragile and worth protecting against the forces of progress and development and forgetfulness that were already, even then, beginning to erase the Victorian world into which she'd been born and replace it with something faster and cheaper and more democratic and arguably uglier. Those widow years from 1917 to 1929 were liminal years, suspended years, years when Naumkeag existed in a kind of holding pattern, neither growing nor shrinking, neither vital nor moribund, waiting for something to happen, for some resolution to arrive, for the inevitable transition that everyone could feel approaching but no one wanted to name. And during those years the world beyond the estate gates was changing in ways that would make the Gilded Age seem as distant and extinct as the medieval period, as impossible to recreate as the court of Versailles. World War I had slaughtered millions and shattered the illusion that civilization was an inevitable upward trajectory, had sent a generation of young men to die in muddy trenches and poison gas attacks that made 19th-century notions of honor and glory seem obscene, had disrupted the global economic system and the social hierarchies that had seemed immutable, and the belief that European culture represented the pinnacle of human achievement. The 1920s roared with jazz and bootleg liquor and a social revolution that made Victorian propriety look hopelessly antiquated and made the carefully maintained boundaries between classes seem increasingly arbitrary and oppressive. Women won the vote and bobbed their hair and smoked cigarettes and demanded independence that their mother's generation wouldn't have dared imagine. The stock market climbed to dizzying heights fueled by speculation in credit and margin buying. And the collective delusion that prices could rise forever without correction or consequence, and most ominously for houses like Naumkeag, the servant problem was becoming acute and apparently insoluble, after experiencing wartime employment in munitions factories and military support roles, after tasting independence and higher wages and the dignity of work that didn't require bowing and scraping and tolerating sexual harassment from employers and the grinding humiliation of being treated as invisible. Fewer and fewer young people were willing to enter domestic service, were willing to spend their lives subordinate and subservient, hauling bath water and scrubbing floors and serving meals to people who often barely acknowledged their existence except to criticize when service fell short of perfection, and the ones who still took those positions demanded higher wages, better working conditions, limited hours, days off, the radical notion that they were human beings with rights rather than merely extensions of the household machinery, which meant that maintaining a 44-room estate became exponentially more expensive just as the supply of willing workers contracted and the social legitimacy of the whole arrangement eroded. Caroline Sterling Choate died in November 1929 at age 92, died just weeks after Black Tuesday and the stock market crash that wiped out billions in paper wealth and heralded the Great Depression, died at the cusp of a decade that would make her Gilded Age world look not just distant but obscene, not just outdated but morally repugnant. Died in her bed, probably surrounded by family and certainly mourned by the Berkshire community that had known her for 4 decades, and when her estate was settled in the methodical manner that wealthy families employ to minimize tax consequences and legal complications, Mabel Choate inherited Naumkeag outright, inherited the house and all 44 rooms and all the furniture and art and porcelain and the thousands of books in the library. Inherited the 8 acres of terraced gardens and the greenhouse and the outbuildings and the staff cottages, inherited the rapidly depleting fortune required to maintain it all, inherited at age 59 the full crushing burden of preserving her parents' legacy, and in that inheritance she discovered both her life's purpose and her life's torment, the thing that would give her existence meaning and the thing that would exhaust her, the achievement that would ensure her place in history and the burden that would consume her remaining years. What does a childless, unmarried woman do with a 44-room summer palace designed for entertaining dozens of guests when the world that created such houses is dying and being mourned by no one except the people who profited from it, when the money is running out and the capital that seemed infinite during your father's lifetime is revealed to be very finite indeed when you're responsible for it, when servants are impossible to find at any price and the ones you do find are sullen and demanding and quit without notice because they know you need them more than they need you, when the Great Depression has made conspicuous consumption seem not just extravagant but morally repugnant and people are literally starving in the streets while you're trying to maintain 8 acres of ornamental gardens, when every summer you rattle around in rooms built for crowds that no longer come because your generation is dying and the next generation doesn't care about your parents' world and wouldn't visit even if invited because they're busy building their own lives in their own styles that reject everything Naumkeag represents. Mabel Choate, to her eternal credit and ultimate exhaustion, decided to fight back against entropy itself, decided that Naumkeag would not just survive but evolve, would become something new, something extraordinary, something that justified its continued existence in an era that had no more use for Gilded Age palaces and was busily demolishing them or converting them to institutions or watching them rot into ruin because no one could afford the maintenance and no one wanted to live that way anymore. In 1926, 3 years before she inherited the property but clearly already thinking about its future, Mabel had attended a Lenox Garden Club meeting where she encountered a dapper, bon vivant landscape architect named Fletcher Steele, age 41. A man who dressed impeccably and spoke with authority and had studied at Harvard and traveled extensively in Europe and Asia and was making his reputation as someone who could bring gardens into the 20th century, who understood modernism and Art Deco and wasn't interested in simply recreating Victorian planting schemes or maintaining historical gardens in Aspic, and that meeting would prove to be the most consequential of her life because Fletcher Steele would become her collaborator, her friend, her creative partner, the person who would help her transform Naumkeag from a relic into a masterpiece. And their partnership would span 30 years and produce some of the most innovative landscape architecture in American history. Gardens that borrowed from Cubism and Surrealism and the Bauhaus, that imported design principles from Chinese gardens and Japanese aesthetics and French formalism and Art Deco cinema, that used color and form and spatial relationships in ways that challenged every assumption about what gardens could be and do. Steele looked at those terraced hillsides that had been laid out in conventional Victorian style, flower beds and lawns and specimen trees arranged pleasantly but predictably, and saw not finished work to be maintained but blank canvases for bold experiments that would shock and delight and challenge visitors to see gardens as art rather than mere decoration, and together he and Mabel created the afternoon garden with its shocking pink concrete walls that seemed impossibly modern in the Berkshire woods and its cutting-edge plant selections that emphasized texture and form over traditional color schemes, created the Chinese garden filled with Mabel's Asian artifacts collected during her travels to the Orient including temple dogs and carved stones and architectural fragments that transformed a garden into a three-dimensional collage of cultural references, created the rose garden that reimagined that most Victorian of flowers in modernist arrangements that emphasize structure and repetition and the interplay between organic forms and geometric frameworks, and most famously, most magnificently, most impossibly, created the blue steps, that cascade of blue-painted concrete stairs flanked by white birch trees and punctuated by Art Deco railings that descend the steep hillside like something from a dream, like something that shouldn't exist in the sober New England landscape but does, gloriously does, each step calibrated to create specific visual effects as you descend, as the white birches frame your vision and create vertical rhythms that contrast with the horizontal flow of the stairs, as the blue, that shocking, unnatural, perfect blue, refuses to let you forget that you're experiencing art rather than nature, that you're inside someone's vision made manifest through money and will and collaboration between a wealthy patron who knew what she wanted and a visionary designer who knew how to achieve it. The Blue Steps, completed in 1938 after years of planning and construction and revision, would become Steele's most famous work, the signature achievement of his career, the image that would appear on the covers of landscape architecture books and in magazine spreads and eventually in thousands of tourist photographs. But here's the dark truth that lurked beneath all that beauty. Every new garden feature, every innovative design, every bold experiment cost money that Mabel increasingly didn't have cost labor that was increasingly hard to find and increasingly expensive to retain, cost maintenance that grew more burdensome every year because concrete needs repainting and birch trees need replacing when they die and the plantings need constant attention to maintain the specific effects that steel designed, and steel's vision, for all its brilliance and all its aesthetic achievement, was creating an estate that was even harder to maintain than the one she'd inherited, was building a legacy that was simultaneously Mabel's greatest achievement and her eventual prison, the thing she'd be remembered for and the thing that would exhaust her, the proof of her vision and the instrument of her defeat. Through the 1930s, as the Great Depression ground on and unemployment hit 25% and breadlines stretched around city blocks and shantytowns called Hooverville sprang up in city parks and the Gilded Age came to seem not just distant but obscene, not just outdated but actively offensive in its display of wealth while millions starved, Mabel kept working on the gardens, kept collaborating with Fletcher Steele on new projects and refinements of old ones, kept fighting to maintain the house even though whole wings stood unused and servants' quarters that had once housed 30 staff now held perhaps 10, kept the skeleton crew of loyal retainers employed even when she could barely afford their wages because firing them felt like betrayal and because without them the house would literally fall apart, the gardens would revert to wilderness, the whole achievement would collapse. And in 1927 she'd taken on another project that would drain her resources further but that she believed was morally necessary. She purchased the historic Mission House, built around 1739 for Reverend John Sargent, an Anglican missionary to the Stockbridge Mohicans who'd lived among them and preached to them and tried to save their souls according to his lights, a building that was on the verge of demolition because no one else cared about saving a colonial-era structure that had no particular architectural distinction and was falling apart and stood in the way of development, a rare surviving example of Georgian colonial architecture that Mabel believed was too important to lose, too valuable as a historical document and educational resource and connection to the region's indigenous past to allow it to be destroyed for a parking lot or gas station. With Fletcher Steele's help she moved the building to a new site, restored it with meticulous attention to period detail and historical accuracy, furnished it with colonial-era antiques that she purchased at auction and through dealers, created gardens meant to evoke what a colonial-era property might have looked like with vegetable plots and herb gardens and fruit trees and the practical plantings that served household needs rather than purely aesthetic purposes, and turned it into one of the first house museums in the Berkshires, a place where the public could come to understand how earlier generations had lived, demonstrating a preservationist ethos that was decades ahead of its time, that anticipated the historic preservation movement that would gain momentum after World War II, but also demonstrating the pattern that would define her life and ultimately destroy her financially, taking on impossible projects, pouring money and effort into saving beautiful things from oblivion, exhausting herself in service to a vision that she could articulate but never fully fund, never quite complete, never rest from pursuing because there was always another building to save or another garden to perfect or another historical artifact to preserve. World War II brought new pressures and new impossibilities that made the Depression years look almost manageable in comparison. Young men who might have worked as groundskeepers were drafted or enlisted and went off to fight in Europe and the Pacific. Young women who might have worked as housemaids took jobs in defense plants and aircraft factories that paid 5 or 10 times what domestic service offered and that came with the satisfaction of supporting the war effort rather than merely maintaining some rich lady's summer house. Gasoline rationing made it difficult to maintain the property and impossible to make non-essential trips. Material shortages meant that repairs were delayed or done with inferior substitutes or not done at all while the damage accumulated. The government was discouraging any spending that didn't directly support the war effort and making wealthy people feel guilty for maintaining private estates when every resource should be directed toward defeating fascism. And Naumkeag, like thousands of great estates across America and Britain, began the slow slide from palace to burden, from showplace to albatross, from dream to nightmare, though Mabel would have died before admitting it publicly, would have insisted even as the roof leaked and the paint peeled and the gardens grew wild in sections she couldn't afford to maintain that everything was fine, that she had it under control, that the empire was not in fact disintegrating around her but simply adjusting to temporary circumstances that would pass and allow restoration of the old order. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, through her 70s and into her 80s, Mabel fought her lonely war against time and entropy and economic reality, fought with the passion and determination of someone who understood at a profound level that Naumkeag was not just a house but a repository of memory, of family history, of aesthetic achievement, of her parents' love story and her own life's meaning. And she could not let it die, because to let it die would be to admit that everything her father had built through his brilliance and wit and legal acumen, everything her mother had nurtured through her taste and education and commitment to beauty as a moral force, everything she herself had created through 3 decades of collaboration with Fletcher Steele was ultimately temporary, ultimately unsustainable, ultimately doomed by the simple mathematical fact that infinite maintenance costs and finite capital can only have one ending. That you cannot indefinitely maintain a 44-room house and 8 acres of intensively designed gardens on a depleting inheritance when every year the costs rise and the capital shrinks and the gap between them widens until bankruptcy or surrender become the only options. Fletcher Steele, that faithful collaborator and friend who'd spent 3 decades bringing Mabel's visions to life and who understood better than anyone except Mabel herself how much Naumkeag meant to her and how much effort and money and emotional energy she'd poured into preserving and transforming it, finally broached the unthinkable suggestion around 1950, that Mabel should donate Naumkeag to the Trustees of Reservations. That organization, founded in 1891 with the specific mission of preserving Massachusetts properties of exceptional scenic, historic, and ecological value, that she should give away her family's estate, her life's work, her parents' legacy, should surrender ownership in exchange for the promise that Naumkeag would survive her death, would be maintained by an organization with resources she lacked, would be open to the public so that future generations could experience what the Choate family had built and what she and Steele had transformed it into, could learn from it and be inspired by it and understand something about American history and garden design and the Gilded Age and what happens when artistic vision meets adequate resources. The conversations between Mabel and Fletcher about Naumkeag's fate must have been agonizing, must have forced her to confront truths she'd spent decades avoiding, that she had no children to inherit the property and carry on her work, that her siblings' descendants were not interested in assuming the burden and had explicitly told her so, that her money was running out faster than she'd expected because inflation was eroding the value of her capital and maintenance costs kept rising and unexpected repairs kept appearing and the math simply didn't work, that she was now 70, then 75, then 80, and the maintenance only got harder with age, the staff only got more expensive and less competent, the house only fell into deeper disrepair despite her best efforts because best efforts cannot overcome insufficient resources, and eventually, inevitably, she would die. And then what would happen to Naumkeag, to the blue steps that she and Fletcher had created, to her mother's Chinese porcelain still displayed in the rooms where Caroline had placed it, to her father's library of thousands of books still shelved where he'd arranged them, to the gardens that represented 30 years of collaboration and innovation and the pouring of money and effort into creating something beautiful and significant. Would distant relatives sell it to a developer who'd tear it down and subdivide the land? Would it sit empty and rot until the roof collapsed and weather destroyed everything inside? Would the gardens revert to forest and the blue steps crack and crumble and the whole achievement disappear as if it had never existed? In 1948, Mabel made her first tentative surrender, testing the waters, seeing how it would feel. She donated the mission house to the Trustees of Reservations along with a substantial endowment for its maintenance, a trial run perhaps, a way of testing whether the organization would honor her vision, whether they would respect the property's history and maintain it to her exacting standards, whether they would interpret it for the public in ways that educated rather than merely entertained, and when they did, when she saw that the mission house was being preserved and interpreted thoughtfully and open to the public in ways that fulfilled her preservationist ideals and justified the decades of effort and money she'd invested in saving and restoring it, she began the painful psychological process of accepting that Naumkeag's future might lie not in private ownership but in public stewardship, that the loss of control might be the price of survival, that surrender might be the only form of victory available to her. Mabel Choate died in New York City on December 11, 1958, at age 87, died a few weeks shy of what would have been her 88th birthday, died in winter when Naumkeag stood empty and cold and the gardens slept beneath snow and the blue steps were invisible and the house waited as it had waited every winter for the family to return in spring, except this time Mabel would not return. Died having spent the last decade of her life preparing for the donation that would be finalized in her will, died knowing that she had both won and lost, had won in preserving Naumkeag for posterity and ensuring that future generations would be able to experience what she and her parents had created, had lost her family's private kingdom and the illusion that individual ownership could sustain such places, had transformed triumph into burden and burden into legacy through a process that required more courage and clearer vision than building the estate had ever demanded of her father, had made the ultimate sacrifice that preservation sometimes requires, giving up what you love so that it might survive you. Her will, carefully drafted with the same legal precision her father would have approved, bequeathed Naumkeag in its entirety to the trustees of reservations, the house with all 44 rooms intact exactly as her family had left them, the furnishings down to the smallest teacup and serving spoon, the art collection that her parents had assembled and she had thoughtfully expanded, the Chinese porcelain and the family portraits and the Tiffany lamps and every material trace of how the Choates had lived, the 8 acres of gardens that she and Fletcher Steele had transformed into a modernist masterpiece of landscape architecture, the greenhouse and the outbuildings and the staff cottages, the substantial endowment that would help maintain it, although even she must have known it wouldn't be enough in perpetuity, the explicit instructions that it should be preserved as it was, that it should tell the story of the Choate family honestly and completely, that it should remain a testament to what Gilded Age wealth created when combined with taste and vision and what one woman's determination and artistic sensibility could achieve even as the age that created such possibilities died around her and left her fighting a rearguard action against time itself. In 1959, just months after Mabel's death and the settlement of her estate, Naumkeag opened to the public for the first time in its 73-year history, no longer a private summer retreat for one privileged family but a museum, a memorial, a public trust, a lesson in American history that was simultaneously inspiring and cautionary, and in the decades since, approximately 11,000 people visit each year to walk through those 44 rooms frozen in time as if the Choate family had simply stepped out and might return at any moment, to descend the blue steps that have become one of the most photographed garden features in America and an icon of 20th-century landscape design, to wander through gardens that show what happens when artistic vision meets adequate resources and sustained maintenance, to understand how the Gilded Age lived and why it could not last, to see what happens when immense wealth meets exceptional taste but encounters the hard reality of finite resources, to learn the lesson that beauty requires maintenance in perpetuity and that maintenance requires either bottomless money or institutional support, that private ownership of great estates is ultimately unsustainable unless the money never runs out, and the money always runs out eventually, the fortune always proves finite, the capital always depletes, the maintenance always exceeds the income, and then the choice becomes abandonment or surrender, letting it die or giving it away, watching your legacy crumble or ensuring its survival by relinquishing control. Today, more than 6 decades after Mabel's death, the trustees of reservations maintains Naumkeag with professional staff and preservation budgets that Mabel could never have mustered alone, no matter how determined she was or how much she sacrificed. Hosts spring tulip festivals and fall pumpkin shows and winter light displays that draw tens of thousands of visitors who wander through gardens that look much as they did when Mabel and Fletcher completed them, though the birch trees flanking the blue steps are taller now because they're not the original plantings and the concrete steps paint needs more frequent refreshing and several sections have required reconstruction and the house requires constant attention to prevent the rot and decay that wait patiently to claim every structure humans abandon, but the essential achievement remains intact. Naumkeag survived, outlived the Gilded Age that created it and the men who built it and the woman who maintained it through grief and the unmarried daughter who reimagined it through vision and the servant economy that made it possible and the social structures that made it necessary and the historical moment that made it conceivable, survived to become something its builders never intended, not a private palace but a public lesson, not a family sanctuary jealously guarded but a shared inheritance freely offered, not a monument to wealth but a question about wealth, about what we build with it and why we build it and what happens when the building is done but the bills keep coming and the builders are dead and the inheritors discover that what looked like empire was actually burden, what looked like gift was actually curse, what looked like triumph was actually the beginning of a long, slow, inevitable loss that could only be arrested by surrender, by the admission that individual fortunes cannot sustain what they create, that beauty outlasts the resources that produce it, that preservation requires surrender of ownership, that the price of survival is always, eventually, the loss of control. So when you visit Naumkeag today, when you walk through rooms where Caroline Choate once presided over glittering dinners and Joseph argued constitutional law with Supreme Court justices and Mabel made her lonely vigil against time, when you climb stairs that servants climb thousands of times carrying trays and hauling bathwater and performing the invisible labor that maintained the illusion of effortless elegance, when you descend those famous blue steps that Mabel Choate and Fletcher Steele created as a defiant gesture toward beauty in an age that was forgetting how to value it and that stand now as perhaps the most perfect expression of their shared vision and the most poignant symbol of what was achieved and what was lost. When you stand on the hilltop and look out over Monument Mountain and the Housatonic River Valley and the Berkshire Hills that glowed with colored autumn fire when the Choates first fell in love with this place more than a century ago, remember that you are standing in the ruins of an empire, not ruins in the physical sense because the buildings still stand and the gardens still bloom, but ruins in the economic and social sense, standing in a palace that was built by one kind of world and can only be preserved by another kind of world entirely, standing in the space between private splendor and public heritage, standing at the exact point where one widow's grief and one daughter's determination met the inexorable mathematics of maintenance costs and finite inheritance and learned the hardest lesson the Gilded Age had to teach, that beauty is not enough, that love is not enough, that dedication and sacrifice and vision are not enough, that individual wealth and will cannot overcome the structural realities of an economy that no longer supports such extravagance, and that the only way to save what you love might be to give it away, to surrender ownership, to admit defeat in order to achieve victory, to lose the empire so that the gardens might survive.